The French Revolution was not born out of a sudden spark, but emerged from the profound contradictions embedded within the Ancien regime, a system that governed France for centuries. At its core, the Ancien regime was a fragile construct, balancing an outdated social hierarchy, economic inequality, and political inefficiency. By the late 18th century, these contradictions had reached a breaking point. The economic structure of the Ancien regime was both exploitative and unsustainable. The monarchy relied heavily on regressive taxation, disproportionately burdening the peasantry and urban workers. Meanwhile, the first two estates, the clergy and the nobility, enjoyed substantial privileges, including exemptions from many taxes. This fiscal imbalance was compounded by decades of war expenditures and the extravagance of the royal court, which drained the treasury. By the 1780s, France was on the brink of bankruptcy, and attempts at reform were systematically blocked by the very elites who benefited from the status quo. Socially, the Ancien regime was defined by rigid stratification. The clergy, though fragmented between high-ranking church officials and lower parish priests, occupied the first estate and wielded significant moral and economic power. The nobility, making up the second estate, jealously guarded their privileges, including feudal rights over the peasantry. Meanwhile, the third estate encompassed everyone else, from prosperous merchants and lawyers to impoverished laborers and peasants. This diverse group shared one unifying grievance, a sense of exclusion from power and justice. Politically, the monarchy's claim to divine right increasingly appeared anachronistic in the Age of Enlightenment. Ideas advocating liberty, equality, and reason began to permeate intellectual and public life, undermining the ideological foundations of absolutism. King Louis XVI, though well-meaning in some respects, proved incapable of addressing the demands of his time. His repeated concessions and retreats, especially in calling the Estates General in 1789, only further exposed the monarchy's vulnerabilities. The structural crisis of the Ancien regime was therefore not merely a product of economic mismanagement or political incompetence, but a system-wide failure to adapt to the changing realities of 18th-century France. The revolution that would erupt in 1789 was, in many ways, the inevitable reckoning for a society trapped between the weight of its past and the pressures of its future. The Constituent Revolution marked the institutionalization of revolutionary ideals through the redefinition of political power and the framework of governance. At its heart was the National Assembly, a body that claimed the authority to speak for the French nation, rather than the monarch or the privileged estates. The work of this assembly would lead to the dismantling of the old order and the drafting of a new constitution, a radical step that sought to reconcile Enlightenment principles with the realities of a fractured society. In August 1789, the National Assembly proclaimed the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a foundational document that enshrined individual liberties and the equality of all men before the law. Drawing inspiration from the American Declaration of Independence and Enlightenment thinkers such as Rousseau and Montesquieu, this declaration rejected the hereditary privileges of the Ancien regime, affirming that sovereignty resided with the nation and not the monarch. Liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression became its guiding principles, challenging the centuries-old foundations of absolute monarchy and feudal society. The legislative reforms that followed sought to codify these ideals into a constitutional framework. The monarchy was preserved but stripped of its divine right aura and subjected to the constraints of constitutional governance. The civil constitution of the clergy of 1790 reorganized the Catholic Church, subordinating it to the state and making clergy salaried public officials. This measure, while intended to secularize authority, alienated many devout Catholics and sowed seeds of future conflict. Economic reforms also accompanied the Constituent Revolution. The Assembly abolished feudal dues, a long-standing source of rural resentment, and nationalized church lands to address the fiscal crisis. However, these measures often fell short of satisfying the peasantry, as the redistribution of land primarily benefited wealthier landowners. Politically, the transformation of France's administrative divisions replaced feudal provinces with a system of departments, rationalizing governance to align with Enlightenment ideals of uniformity and efficiency. Meanwhile, voting rights were extended to property-owning males, creating a framework for representation that nonetheless excluded the poorest segments of society. The Constituent Revolution represented a paradox. While it sought to establish a more just and egalitarian order, its compromises, especially those that favored the bourgeoisie, exposed rifts within the revolutionary coalition. The work of the National Assembly laid the groundwork for the Republic, but it also revealed the challenges of aligning lofty ideals with the realities of governance in a period of social upheaval. The revolutionary escalation of the French Revolution transformed a constitutional reform movement into a radical upheaval that reshaped every facet of French society. What began as an attempt to balance monarchy with representative governance soon spiraled into a volatile struggle for power, driven by mounting internal tensions and external threats. The early optimism of reform gave way to division as different factions within the revolution pursued conflicting agendas. The bourgeoisie, who had dominated the early stages of the revolution, sought to stabilize their newfound influence within a constitutional monarchy. However, the growing demands of the urban working class, or sans-culottes, and the rising expectations of the rural peasantry pushed the revolution in increasingly radical directions. These pressures exposed fractures within the revolutionary coalition, pitting moderates against radicals. The escalation was further accelerated by the external threat of war. By 1792, the revolutionary government faced growing hostility from European monarchies, alarmed by the spread of revolutionary ideas. France's declaration of war on Austria and Prussia marked the beginning of a long conflict that heightened internal polarization. As foreign armies marched toward French borders, suspicion of counter-revolutionary conspiracies reached fever pitch, fueling demands for more drastic measures. This sense of urgency culminated in the fall of the monarchy. The storming of the Tuileries Palace in August 1792, driven by a coalition of radical Jacobins and enraged sans-culottes, forced King Louis XVI into imprisonment. Shortly thereafter, the National Convention abolished the monarchy and declared the French Republic, severing centuries of royal rule in a dramatic break with the past. The revolution's internal dynamics became increasingly defined by the struggle between moderate Girondins and radical Montagnards, who were supported by the sans-culottes. The Girondins, advocating for a more decentralized and measured approach, found themselves outmaneuvered by the Montagnards, who pushed for centralization and swift action to suppress perceived threats. This power struggle culminated in the execution of the king in January 1793, a turning point that irrevocably aligned the revolution with the principles of radical republicanism. Amid escalating fears of counter-revolution, the revolution's rhetoric of liberty gave way to the reality of coercion. The Committee of Public Safety, dominated by figures like Robespierre, centralized authority to respond to both internal dissent and external war. This consolidation of power set the stage for the Reign of Terror as the revolutionary government turned against perceived enemies, both real and imagined. The revolutionary escalation revealed the fragility of revolutionary ideals when confronted with the practical challenges of governing a divided society under siege. What had started as a revolution of principles became a revolution of survival, with profound consequences for France and the broader world. The rivalry between the Girondins and the Montagnards was one of the defining conflicts of the French Revolution, a political struggle that highlighted the deep divisions within the revolutionary movement. These factions, both committed to the Republican principle, diverged sharply in their visions for France's future, their strategies, and their methods for achieving revolutionary goals. The Girondins, named after the Gironde region many of their leaders represented, were characterized by their moderate stance and their emphasis on decentralization. They were largely composed of bourgeois intellectuals and provincial representatives who advocated for constitutional governance and economic liberalization. The Girondins championed the ideals of individual freedoms and sought to protect property rights. They were wary of the growing influence of Paris and the radicalism of the sans-culottes, whom they viewed as a destabilizing force. This mistrust led the Girondins to argue for a broader, more inclusive revolution that would respect the autonomy of local governments. In contrast, the Montagnards, or the Mountain, derived their name from their position on the high benches of the National Convention. They were closely aligned with the Jacobin Club and drew support from the radicalized urban populace of Paris, particularly the Sans-Culottes. The Montagnards, led by figures such as Robespierre, Danton, and Marat, believed in a centralized state capable of enforcing revolutionary ideals. They were less inclined to prioritize individual liberties when these conflicted with the broader revolutionary goal of social equality. For the Montagnards, the revolution's survival depended on decisive, sometimes coercive measures, including the use of violence to suppress counter-revolutionary forces. The conflict between these factions came to a head in the context of France's external and internal crises. The Girondins advocated for a more restrained approach to governance, including a less radical response to perceived threats. They were hesitant to execute King Louis XVI, fearing that his death would deepen divisions within France and provoke retaliation from foreign powers. The Montagnards, by contrast, argued that the king's execution was essential to solidify the republic and eliminate any possibility of a return to monarchy. When the king was executed in January 1793, the Montagnards cemented their dominance in the National Convention. The rivalry reached its climax in June 1793, when the Montagnards, supported by the Sans-Culottes, orchestrated a purge of the Girondins from the convention. This marked a turning point in the revolution, as power consolidated around the Montagnards and the Committee of Public Safety, ushering in the Reign of Terror. The Girondins, many of whom were arrested and later executed, became martyrs for the cause of moderation and constitutionalism, their defeat symbolizing the revolution's shift toward radical centralization. The Girondins and Montagnards represented two competing revolutionary philosophies, one rooted in moderation and individual rights, the other in radical equality and collective action. Their conflict underscored the challenges of unity within a revolution defined by competing visions of liberty, equality, and justice. The revolutionary government and the Reign of Terror marked the most radical and controversial phase of the French Revolution. As the revolution faced mounting external and internal threats, the mechanisms of governance transformed, prioritizing survival and ideological purity over individual freedoms. The establishment of the Committee of Public Safety in 1793 marked a pivotal shift in revolutionary governance. This body, dominated by figures such as Robespierre, Saint-Just, and Couthon, wielded near-dictatorial authority under the guise of safeguarding the Republic. Tasked with defending the revolution from enemies within and without, the committee centralized power, reducing the role of the National Convention to little more than a rubber-stamping assembly. This consolidation of authority was justified by the argument that extraordinary times demanded extraordinary measures. Internally, France was fractured by counter-revolutionary uprisings, most notably the Vovelle Rebellion, where royalist and Catholic forces resisted the revolutionary government. Externally, a coalition of European monarchies was determined to crush the revolution, perceiving it as an existential threat to the old order. Faced with this dual crisis, the revolutionary government adopted policies of repression, culminating in the Reign of Terror. The terror was rooted in the revolutionary principle of salus populi suprema lex esto. The safety of the people is the supreme law. Revolutionary tribunals were established to identify and punish enemies of the revolution. These courts operated with ruthless efficiency, often condemning individuals based on vague accusations or ideological deviations. Prominent figures such as Queen Marie Antoinette, Girondin leaders, and even revolutionary radicals like Hébert and Danton were swept away by the guillotine. Robespierre emerged as the most prominent figure of this period, promoting a vision of virtue intertwined with terror. He argued that terror was an instrument of justice, necessary to cleanse the Republic of corruption and counter-revolutionary elements. Under his leadership, the revolutionary government intensified its efforts to enforce ideological conformity. The Law of 22 Prairial, passed in June 1794, removed basic legal protections for the accused, accelerating the pace of executions. The government's policies extended beyond repression to reshape French society. Efforts were made to de-Christianize France, replacing religious institutions with revolutionary festivals and the cult of the supreme being, an attempt to align spirituality with revolutionary ideals. Economic measures, such as price controls and requisitioning, were implemented to address shortages and stabilize the war effort. However, these policies often alienated both peasants and urban workers, exacerbating tensions within the revolutionary coalition. By mid-1794, the intensity of the terror began to undermine its own justification. The purges had created an atmosphere of paranoia, where even members of the revolutionary government feared for their lives. Robespierre's fall on 9 Thermidor Year 2, July 27, 1794, marked the end of the terror, as moderates in the convention turned against him and his closest allies. His execution symbolized a rejection of the radical centralization and violent measures that had defined this period. The revolutionary government and the terror remain a defining episode in the history of the revolution, illustrating the extremes to which the revolutionaries were willing to go in the name of liberty, equality, and the republic. It was a phase where ideology clashed with practicality, and the revolution's ideals were often overshadowed by the violence used to enforce them. The French Revolution stands as a defining moment in modern history, reshaping political, social, and cultural paradigms in ways that continue to resonate. What began as a challenge to monarchical absolutism and entrenched privilege evolved into a radical experiment in sovereignty, citizenship, and equality. Its trajectory, from the optimism of constitutional reform to the radicalism of the Reign of Terror and beyond, revealed both the transformative potential and the inherent contradictions of revolutionary movements. The principles articulated in 1789, the rights of man, popular sovereignty, and equality before the law, became cornerstones of modern political thought, inspiring movements across Europe and the world. However, the revolution also exposed the complexities of translating these ideals into practice. Competing visions of governance, class tensions, and the pressures of war repeatedly tested the revolution's coherence, culminating in a cycle of radicalization and repression. By 1799, the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte signaled the revolution's end as a purely ideological endeavor, replaced by the pragmatic consolidation of power under a centralized state. Yet the legacy of the revolution endured, not only in the institutional and social reforms it enacted, but also in the symbolic language of emancipation and rights it bequeathed to future generations. The French Revolution was not a single, unified event but a series of overlapping revolutions driven by different actors, motivations, and contexts. It remains a subject of intense debate, embodying the tension between revolutionary idealism and the complexities of human governance. As historians continue to interpret its meanings, the revolution remains both a historical event and a lens through which to examine the aspirations and challenges of modernity itself. We'd love to hear your thoughts on possible future topics. What areas of human evolution would you like to explore next? Leave your suggestions in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going. As always, our references and further reading are listed in the description below if you'd like to dive deeper into the subject. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next episode. And do not forget, subscribe to the knowledge.